This week is a significant one for all those connected with the work of Carl Fabergé. The legendary Russian goldsmith died 100 years ago, on the 24th of September 1920 to be precise. This is Katherine Purcell, and I'm here at Wartski with my colleague Kieran McCarthy, Fabergé specialist in London and board member of the Fabergé Museum in St. Petersburg. We are exploring our extensive Fabergé archive, built over generations of research at Wartski, and reading, for the first time, Eugene Fabergé's intimate account of his father's final years, culminating in the last moments of his life.
Yes, Carl Fabergé died a century ago, and despite the successes in his own time, he could never have expected to have become so famous in the intervening years. Over the last 100 years, his name has become a byword for luxury, and his famous Easter eggs in particular have been elevated to the status of the greatest treasures ever made by man.
He was indeed a remarkable man. What do we know about him as a person?
Well, very little actually. He didn't keep diaries, and there are scant references to his personality. He speaks to us primarily through his works. They display a remarkably refined artistry. Although he worked in gold and precious materials, he was first and foremost an artist, not a businessman. In 1914, he commented, "Objects interest me little if their value is merely in so many diamonds and pearls." And his London lawyer communicated pretty much the same when he compared valuing Fabergé's works on the basis of their materials to assessing the National Gallery as a collection of canvases. The references we do have for his personality mainly come from the memoirs of Beerbaum, his chief designer, and Bainbridge, his London agent and later biographer. They present an image of a man blessed with a curious mind, who was meticulous, inventive, didn't suffer fools gladly, but was also very nurturing of talent, quiet, and I think above all, unassuming.
Fabergé died in Lausanne in Switzerland. How did this come to be and why there?
The new communist Russia was no place for a business such as Fabergé's. It was closed, and he fled to Europe, eventually finding himself in Lausanne, where he passed away.
We're very lucky to have as part of Wartski's Fabergé archive copies of letters written by Fabergé's son Eugene, containing evocative accounts of Fabergé fleeing Russia and of his very last moments.
We do. They are letters written by Eugene to Henry Bainbridge whilst he was helping him write Bainbridge's biography of his father.
And these have never been published or explored in detail before. What do they tell us about Fabergé's escape from Russia and his ultimate death?
Well, they tell us a great deal, and you're right, they have never seriously been looked into before. And this is, of course, an ideal time to hear from Eugene, in his own words, what happened to his father. During the Great War, Fabergé supported the effort, and the demand for jewels, of course, faded away as the guns started firing. His workshops were turned to producing parts for hand grenades, and the aluminium and copper elements of projectiles. The craftsman's ability to work platinum and gold to find tolerances in happier, more peaceful times transferred ideally to working in baser metals for munitions.
And what happened subsequently?
The firm was, of course, destined to close under the Bolsheviks. Eugene wrote of its inevitable fate. The firm of Mr. Carl Fabergé has existed nearly 77 years and was then nationalised by the Bolsheviks, who have robbed what they could find in the premises. In the sentence that follows this, he expresses rather tragically a never-to-be-filled ambition, writing, "If we might live long enough to exist, that some real order will again reign in Russia, we don't lose the idea to go back and perhaps to try to restore the old affair." The old affair is such a fabulous phrase, I just love it.
Where did he go from there?
Fabergé's wealth and personal relationship with the imperial family made him vulnerable in the new Russia. Eugene tells us that he fled first from St. Petersburg to nearby Riga in Latvia. From there, he was pushed onwards by a tide of historical events. In December 1918, when the Bolsheviks attacked Riga, he sought refuge in Berlin. Germany was, however, also suffering from severe political unrest, and revolutionary gunfire opened up on the streets of the German capital. Fearing a Bolshevik-inspired revolution in the city, Karl escaped to Frankfurt, then eventually on to Hamburg, and finally to Wiesbaden. Tramping from location to location took its toll on his health, and Eugene recalled in his letter to Bainbridge that his father fell ill in Wiesbaden. While there, he celebrated his 74th birthday with Eugene, his wife Augusta Julia, and 15 friends who had either travelled or themselves fled from St. Petersburg. Eugene, however, remembered it was not the happiest of occasions and wrote of it. He was rather sad and not so jolly as usual at this day, surely feeling that it was his last one. His mood was suppressed, and Eugene goes on to say he said sometimes, "This is no life, no more."
That is such a sad statement. Is there any further information about his final days?
In June 1920, Eugene and Augusta took Carl to Lausanne in Switzerland. There, in a villa beside the shores of Lake Geneva, he initially regained some energy. From here on, I'll pass over entirely to Eugene and let his words tell us of the time his father spent there. They were written by him on the 30th of March, 1931. Here, he felt himself rather better, undertaking sometimes excursions to Ouchy, Nyon and Montreux on the Geneva lake with his grandson Peter, Agathon Fabergé's son. Nevertheless, he was suffering from inactivity, having always been most laborious, active and diligent. Such a life without work was insupportable for him. He repeated often, "Such a life is not a life any more. When I cannot work and be useful, it is not worthwhile to live." His heart was broken. Eugene continues, "After having worked 50 years, after having created a first-class jewellery firm, known all over the world, after having lived a good, prosperous, beautiful and laborious life, he was forced to observe how all of the work of his life broke down so stupidly and senseless. This gave him the last shock. Once, end of July 1920, he fell down on the floor of his room of weakness and had since to guard the bed. Till his end, he kept his mind clear and was interested in all what happened in the world, reading every day newspapers and a lot of interesting books from the library we brought him every day. The doctors found with him a cancer of the liver, but happily he did not suffer of and never complained. He passed away quietly without suffering in the presence of his wife early in the morning of the 24th of September 1920, having smoked half an hour before the half of a cigarette. After his wishes, he has been incinerated at the Lausanne crematorium under the sound of a Beethoven mass which he liked.
Gosh, those words from Eugene show that his father really died a broken-hearted man. What happened next, and where was he laid to rest?
Well, his wife, Augusta, moved to Paris, and she died on the 27th of January 1925 during a trip to the south of France, and was buried in a cemetery in Cannes on the French Riviera. In May 1930, Eugene took his father's ashes to Cannes and buried them in the same grave. Fittingly, and in honour of his Huguenot origins, it was a Protestant cemetery in Cannes. Eugene tells us, again in slightly broken English, "I carried from Lausanne my father's ashes to Cannes, and buried then in my mother's grave, and set up a noble and modest, at same time, as my parents have all their life been of great modesty, a gravestone of black Swedish porphyry, with gilded letters after the wishes of my father, who liked to have a black gravestone with gilded letters." The simplicity of the gravestone, made to Fabergé's last instruction, is a reflection of the timeless refinement of all of his life's work. May Carl Fabergé continue to rest in peace beneath it.
Well, thank you, Kieran. That was such a moving account of Carl Fabergé's final moments, as recounted by his son. How fitting that we should hear them on the centenary of Carl Fabergé's death.